Welcome to our fourth class on the Bible. Let's start with a quick review. Last time we looked at the story of Israel after the time of the judges, when God anointed first Saul and then David to serve as kings. The country was united under David and began to prosper militarily, politically, and economically, becoming a regional power. God promised that an heir of David would always sit on the throne. This is known as the covenant with David. David is both saint and sinner. He follows Yahweh and worships only him, but his relationship with his wives, children, and followers often leave much to be desired. Solomon followed David on the throne, and after a battle for succession, and continued David's building projects, most notably the temple in Jerusalem. After Solomon's death, the country divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Eventually, both the northern and southern kingdoms fail, and the people are taken into exile. This leads us to the prophets. This PowerPoint is the same as the one showing the history of the kings of both the northern and southern kingdoms, now with the prophets superimposed at the times they were active. As history progressed, Yahweh raised up people to deliver messages that spoke to the conditions in the nation. God used the prophets to speak his words to the people and their leaders. The prophets spoke at a time when economic prosperity led to decreased dependence on God, while a widening gap between the rich and the poor influenced how justice was experienced. As Israel and Judah gained stature in the region, they made partnerships with other nations whose religions influenced and even threatened the worship of Yahweh. The religious leaders were tempted to focus on developing and preserving the religious structures and systems that kept them in power, rather than guiding the people to be faithful to God. The basis of the message of the prophets were the covenants, especially the covenant at Sinai. The prophets worked to remind the people of God's character, how God had been just and merciful to them, and how they were to live in response to this love by showing justice and generosity to others. They spoke to present conditions, the here and now. The prophets warned repeatedly that persistent disobedience to the covenant would lead to punishment in the form of exile from the land. They called the people to repent and restore their relationship with God by following the covenant again. The choice the prophets offered was simple. Either repent and turn back to Yahweh, or continue to disobey and lose the land. The message of the prophets addressed the sins of the people as individuals, as well as the sins of the nation as a whole. The people were destroying themselves, their community, and their nation. The prophets called the people to come back to Yahweh, who would heal them and the nation. The prophetic literature is vast, so we'll take a tour of the major emphasis of the prophet's message. We'll begin with the prophet Hosea. Hosea points out that the people were ignorant or indifferent to the law codes. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. The covenant at Sinai included the stipulation that the people were to read the laws regularly and to teach them to their children. This wasn't happening. If you don't know God's law, it's hard to do what God instructs. The prophet Micah accused the people of defining good and evil by themselves, rather than the way God defined good and evil. Listen, you leaders of Jacob, you rulers of the house of Israel. Should you not know justice, you who hate good and love evil? The people had it exactly backwards. They loved evil instead of loving good, and then hated the good instead of hating the evil. They were turning the world upside down. This was the responsibility of the leaders especially, to lead the people in doing justice. Micah also decried the fact that money was corrupting the mission of the chosen people. Her leaders judge for a bribe, her priests teach for a price, her prophets tell fortunes for money. People could buy the answers they wanted instead of the answers they needed. Truth was bought and sold rather than people seeking God's truth. The prophet Amos denounced the corruption that permeated the economic system. Listen to this, you who rob the poor and trample the needy. You measure out your grain in false measures and weigh it out on dishonest scales. Then you enslave poor people for a debt of one piece of silver or a pair of sandals. The rich were getting richer, and the poor were getting poorer because they were exploited by the powerful. The poor had such little value that they were thrown into jail for the price of a sandal, what would be a pittance to the rich. The prophet Ezekiel charged the rich with abandoning the poor and focusing on their own comfort and luxury. This was the sin. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. Pride got in the way of helping those who were less fortunate. The rich had achieved their goals and didn't care they were living at the expense of others. They focused on their own comfort and luxury and neglected to see that all people had the basic necessities of life. Now, it wasn't only the sins of the people the prophets criticized, but the sins of the nation as a whole. Amos speaks against the systemic problems the justice and political system had created. How you hate honest judges, how you despise people who tell the truth. You trample the poor and steal what little they have through taxes and unfair rent. The powerful use the political, economic, and judicial systems to further their pet causes and increase their wealth at the expense of the poor. The prophets were certain that the covenant at Sinai was very clear about justice for everyone being equal, not tilted in the favor of the rich and powerful. The prophet Micah warned the nation that their over-reliance on military might would lead to their downfall. I will destroy all your weapons, your horses and chariots. I will tear down your walls and demolish the defenses of your cities. The leaders had exchanged the protection Yahweh promised for bigger and better weapons and larger armies to protect the nation from foreign enemies. Finally, Hosea condemns the nation for looking to protect themselves by putting their trust in other nations. Ephraim is like a dove, easily deceived and senseless, now calling to Egypt, now turning to Assyria. Instead of looking to the superpowers of their era to protect them by forming alliances and signing treaties, the nation was supposed to look to God to defend her against any enemy. The prophets proclaimed that the test of true faith was determined by what happened in the marketplace in the neighborhood, not by what happened in the temple. They pointed to the relationship between the practice of justice in society and long-term prosperity. If God made them prosperous, they were required to use their wealth and influence to serve others, not themselves. When the people became indifferent to God's will, systemic problems developed, which perpetuated injustices and led people away from God. When Israel rebelled against the covenant, God kept his promises and disciplined his people. In 721 BC, the Assyrians took the northern kingdom of Israel into exile. The Assyrians' method of conquering people was to take a defeated people from their homeland and settle them elsewhere, moving a different conquered people back into the vacated land, mixing nations up. This is where we get the idea of the 10 lost tribes. A large portion of the people who lived in the northern kingdom of Israel were resettled in Assyria and intermarried with other nations. A small portion of Israelites were left behind to tend the fields and crops, and they intermarried with the people Assyria imported. This gives rise to the people called the Samaritans. The southern kingdom of Judah was taken into exile in 2 waves. The first being in 597 BC, when King Jehoiachin rebelled, and then in 587 BC, when King Zedekiah revolted against the Babylonian overlords. The Babylonians destroyed the temple as well as Jerusalem herself. Both kings who were among the Babylonian exiles died in Babylon. Finally, a third wave of refugees from Jerusalem fled to Egypt in 582 BC. David's dynasty had seemingly come to an end. During the exile, the people were treated fairly well, and the prophets told them to integrate into their new communities. So many people put down roots and established themselves. While in exile, the people wrestled with some really tough questions. Is this the end of the nation of Israel? The end of Jerusalem? The end of the temple? And the end of the covenant with David? Did Yahweh really exist? Or should we worship the gods here in Babylon? During the 70 years of the exile, the prophets urged the people to hold on to their faith in Yahweh. The prophet Isaiah offered words of comfort and hope to the Jewish people when he declared God was ready to rescue them. Tell her that her sad days are gone and that her sins are pardoned. The prophet Isaiah offered these words of comfort, and then the exile ended when Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon and allowed the Jewish exiles to return to their land, beginning in 538 BC. The first group to return to Jerusalem were met with rubble, not the Messianic age they thought was dawning. They found opposition from the people who had been left behind at the time of the exile and struggled to rebuild. They began by setting up the altar, restoring some worship in Jerusalem, and finally rebuilding and rededicating the temple in 515 BC. This second temple was much less grand than Solomon's temple, and a reminder that the Messianic age they had expected had not arrived. About 60 years after the first group returned, a second group arrived, led by the priest Ezra. His goal was to teach the Torah and lead the people to renew their commitment to the Sinai covenant. Ezra condemned the mixed marriages with Gentile women and demanded the Jewish men divorce their Gentile wives and denounce their children. Being Jewish was now defined as having a Jewish mother, so that the children automatically belonged to Yahweh. A third group returned, led by Nehemiah, who spearheaded the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem and its walls. They were successful in the reconstruction, though they were bitterly opposed by the surrounding people. The return after the exile had begun with such high hopes, but ended with great disappointment. Because of the Jewish experience with the exile and the return, they began to focus on preserving, studying, interpreting, and applying the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The people did not want to go into exile ever again, so they thought they could avoid a second exile by following the minute details of the law. The emphasis on the law also led to the neglect of the prophetic writings. The greater concern was for genetic purity and external religious rituals, rather than the justice and mercy the prophets had proclaimed. The story of the Old Testament ends, and the Bible is quiet for 400 years. Yet, there is much happening in Judaism. This era is called the intertestamental period. Politically, the Greeks rose to power. Alexander the Great conquered much of the ancient Near East and had aspirations to conquer the whole known world, but he died during this campaign, and his kingdom was divided among his 4 generals. Israel came under Greek control. The Jews began to struggle for freedom from the Greeks, and in 165 BC, a revolt broke out, led by Judas Maccabeus. The Jews won semi-independence in 142 BC and established a new line of kings. But the kings weren't descendants of David. They were descendants of the Hasmoneans. Next, the Romans overthrew the Greeks, and in 63 BC, Judah became a Roman province under Roman occupation. The Romans gave Herod the Great the title King of the Jews in 37 BC. Herod was greatly resented by the people. Herod was actually a descendant of Esau, not Jacob, so he should never have held the throne. Add to that, Herod was more loyal to Rome than to his own people, ruling ruthlessly for 33 years. In order to increase his popularity, Herod attempted to expand the territory of Judea and regain land previously won by King David. He also authorized new building projects, including a promise in 19 BC to rebuild the temple and return it to its former glory. Herod died in 4 BC, and his kingdom was divided among his 4 sons. The son who had control over Judea and Samaria was even more brutal than his father Herod the Great, so Rome replaced him with Roman governors. This is how Pontius Pilate became the ruler during Jesus' ministry. The Roman governors had control over the Roman army of occupation, the temple, and the temple funds, and even appointed the Jewish high priest. The governor also had the power of life and death over the people and could reverse death sentences handed down by the Jewish religious court, the Sanhedrin. In the 1st century AD, Judah remained under Roman control. The Davidic dynasty had not been reestablished after the exile, and the nation was never politically independent again. Various factions arose in this time. The Pharisees were well-educated laymen who paid great attention to the outward expressions of faith, like keeping the Sabbath and tithing. They tended to adhere to the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. They believed in resurrection and felt that writings beyond the Torah, like the prophetic writings, were just as important as the Torah. Now, the Sadducees were from the aristocracy and the wealthy high priestly families. Their focus was the temple and keeping the worship rituals as precisely as possible, especially the sacrifices. They held to the Torah as the only sacred writing. In contrast to the Pharisees, the Sadducees did not believe in resurrection. This group disappears when the temple is destroyed in 70 AD. The scribes were experts in the study of the law and served in the Jewish religious court, the Sanhedrin, as judges. The Zealots formed about 6 BC to protest the Roman occupation and paying taxes to Rome. They believed violence was necessary to overthrow the Romans. To the Romans, the Zealots were terrorists, but to the Jews, they were freedom fighters. By the 1st century, several core Jewish beliefs had solidified. There is one God, and He is Yahweh. Only the Jewish people could know and belong to Yahweh. The Torah, or law, is the link between God and His people. The Torah was spoken of as the bread of life, the water of life, and the light of the world. But what happened to the covenant with Abraham, God's rescue plan from Genesis chapter 12? The land was occupied by a foreign power, the Romans. The promise of offspring was kept. Many nations claimed that they were descendants of Abraham. The sense of mission, to be a blessing to the nations, was muddled. Some Jews believed that they needed to make God known to other nations, to be active evangelists. Others believed that Gentiles would flock to Jerusalem to learn about God, passive evangelism. Still others despised the Gentiles and believed God would eventually crush them and make them servants of Israel. All of this sets the stage for Jesus. Some important takeaways today. The prophets were set by God to call the people back to Him, to follow the covenant of Sinai with justice and generosity. The true test of faith was what happened in the marketplace and the neighborhood, not in the temple. The people ignored the prophets, and God punished their disobedience by removing them from the land and sending them into exile. God continued to be faithful and brought the people out of exile and reestablished them in the land, though not to their previous glory. God continued to work to fulfill the covenant with Abraham, the covenant at Sinai, and the covenant with David, but in very unexpected ways. Now, if you'd like more detail about the stories from today, the prophets, the exile, and return, I'd encourage you to check out the handouts that have reading and study suggestions. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we'll turn to the Gospels and the story of Jesus. Until then, keep the faith.